Hey, I'm Adam Mixter, and this is my session Nerd Alert Live. Uh, Obviously, if you're watching this, maybe you did go to Experience and you just missed this one, and you're just curious to know now that we have all this stuff posted. But yeah, I just want to go through this one with you here in my home office. I probably should have blurred the background, but whatever. I guess you can see what my home office is like now. So let's get into it here. So basically, this presentation is actually partly based on the following. If you haven't heard of it, we at Configura have made a podcast called Snap Into It. I'm actually one of the co-hosts along with Audrey Moore. Together, we actually work on this podcast because we're really passionate about the user experience. Me as the head of support and training, and Audrey as a UX researcher. Both of us have a background in really caring and making sure that the users feel happy with our software, happy with our products, that sort of thing. This entire presentation is actually named after one of our recurring segments on the podcast called Nerd Alert. It started out being something where I would explain a concept in CET because I have a reputation here at Configura for being pretty good at explaining those highly technical things to people who don't have that technical background in a way they feel like they can understand at least. And somebody had suggested that I try that. So we do that. Now that the podcast has been going for a little bit, I have strayed into a little bit of science or something else I'm interested in. And of course, if you're ever interested in giving us feedback on the podcast or you want to hear me talk about something else on there, feel free to email snapintoit@configura.com. And check us out, please. So yeah, I really wanted to put a warning on this to save you some time, really. This is advanced content, and this should be probably the most advanced user session we're going to have this year. We're really going to get into it today because basically the point of this is just to hit you with some knowledge, to really give people what they say they've been looking for years, which is more advanced content. And I thought, well, let's just take the gloves off and I'll just have me, a developer, kind of talk to you as an end user a little bit about the software and how some stuff works. This isn't practical use of the software. I don't think you're going to leave this presentation with a really cool new set of skills in CET. If I'm being totally honest, a lot of the people that work for me as the head of support and training are actually better with CET than I am. I would argue some of them are the best in the world with the software. So it's difficult for me to say that I have better tips or knowledge than our user trainers, but I do think it's some interesting stuff that I can tell you. So if at this point you decide, hey, yeah, I'm good, I think I'm out, I totally get it. In this case, I can't see you leave. But had you been there in person, I guess I would have seen you walk out. And I'm not going to take it personal or anything like that. I totally get it. This is going to be some crazy stuff we're talking about. So let me give you an idea of what the crazy is today. We're going to talk about some developer terms. We're going to talk about what the word core means that you've probably heard. We're going to talk about how blocks work. We're going to talk about why updates often get stuck. And I misspelled that. So because I'm recording this now, I guess you have to deal with the typos that I will fix in a little bit here. Have you ever loaded a blank drawing and had a manufacturer claim to be in it? And then we're also going to talk about our undo system. Assuming that sounds good to you, I also wanted to introduce you to this concept of a cat tax. I know not everyone's familiar with it, but it's kind of an internet meme thing. It's a little bit old actually at this point, but the idea being that the internet loves cats, and sometimes people have some very long, boring things to write in a forum or on Reddit or something like that. So at the end of their very long, dramatic, or uninteresting post, they'll put a cute picture of a cat. I currently don't have any cats, but some of my coworkers do. So that's what the pictures are going to be of. And my mom's cat, actually. But this is actually one of my favorite cat pictures ever. I just think it's really funny. Every time you see the cat tax pop up, that's an indication that we're about to change to a totally new topic. If I was watching this, since you have this advantage, I would actually consider maybe taking a quick pause, hitting the bathroom, grabbing a coffee, something like that, and then coming back to it. Because this is actually like intended to be a palate cleansing moment. We're going to change topics quite a bit. And while things do follow a very logical flow, there is going to be some room for breathing and some room to kind of absorb this stuff if you really want to. So moving on. So our first topic today is terminology. With terminology, we actually have a hard time communicating between the developer community and the user community. And that's because we often use different terminology to describe things. Sometimes we're limited by industry terms to try to communicate information to our end users. As the head of support and training, I manage a few really great people. One of them, actually, all the people that I manage, their cats will be in this at some point. So I guess maybe I can talk about them a little bit. But one of the people I manage is the user training manager named Rachel. And Rachel actually and I have argued a little bit about what we should call things. And she wins this argument because she's right. But to best communicate ideas to somebody who's using our software, we need to stick to those terms that people are used to. If we deviate too far, if we go too far from what we're used to, we can end up saying something really odd or making it harder to communicate. So we really need to nail it with the things that you're used to hearing. So in some cases, and actually I think is like the biggest case, that's actually what happens. So we'll talk about that in a second. But that's the idea, is to just try to stay as like reasonable as possible. For developers, we don't have that advantage. A lot of the developers in the industry come from a computer science background. They studied programming in college, or like myself, maybe they're self-taught. But either way, they don't really usually have a commercial interior design background. I don't know any developers that actually are commercial interior designers. I don't think I've met one. Not that we don't like doing this work. It's just that we're not equipped to understand these things, at least at first. So part of what I've always been trying to do is try to help the developers understand our users and help our users understand our developers. So in an effort to do that, here's some terminology that you may not recognize. The word connector. Connectors are often referred to as a node and when we do user training. It's these little yellow guys that you've probably seen. In this case, this yellow node is a cylinder that can actually be clicked and dragged to stretch the size of the table. On the other end, this is actually a connector as well. This one's cone shaped, and then you can actually click it to actually make that space between the tables, kind of make the one table jump away from the other. And in this case, it can also be stretched as well. If you were to click and drag, that would stretch. Connectors also determine how and when objects will connect to each other. In this case, this is a legal connection from the connector's point of view. These things can connect, but those rules are actually determined by the connector. Something that's kind of odd about software development that you might not expect is this thing in the middle here, this round doodad, is actually technically a connector as well. It's not a connector that does any connecting, and there's actually a section later to talk about inheritance that will help you understand why a little bit that we do this. But this guy here is actually like the rotate connector, which you've seen on probably every object you've put into your drawing and clicked and dragged and watched it turn around. That is actually just another type of connector. We actually have dozens of types of connectors in CET, and they all have different purposes and different reasons for existing. But this is the usual term, a connector. That's what those little yellow node things are usually called, or always called, I should say. Next up is snappers. Snapper is actually the developer term for symbol in CET. Like I said, often called a symbol. And they snap to other objects via those connectors. So there's actually two different groups of developers at Configura. Not that this is the only thing that differentiates developers working in, I should say, it's in CET even, not just at Configura. But with the term snapper, it's actually about the snapping that object does to the connector. So if the two connectors say, yep, these things match and they can go together, snapper A will jump and connect to snapper B. And that's actually why it's called a snapper, because it snaps to the thing. I actually think that snapper is a great term for these, but I know that there actually is some controversy. This is where that two-group controversy comes in. Because the snapper is often what people think that the connector should be called. but that's just not the way the architects of the software wrote it. So we're all kind of stuck with this term snapper. We'll never change this because it would be insane to try to do so. But yeah, I'm going to actually use the term snapper because, like I said, I actually have a developer background. So this is actually what I'm used to. There's actually a lot of unusual objects that are snappers. This is actually due to that inheritance thing that I was talking about before. Like I said, hold on, we'll get to it. But viewports are actually a snapper. So these little viewports that you put into your paper space to see something is actually a snapper. And I just said paper space. What's a space? A space is where a snapper can be placed. There's a lot of different kinds of spaces. We actually have a paper space, main space, a block space, an alternative space, and there's actually probably a few others. Actually, I know there's a few others that I'm not actually talking about here. But there's actually quite a few different kinds of spaces. And some manufacturers make their own space. Just to give you an idea of what these will be like, here's main space. This is like the main area where I put some snappers. You can see I have some blocks in this main space. If I click into one, I end up inside what's called the block space. And from there, I go over to paper view or paper space, and I'm actually looking at my paper space where my viewport is. The last term for what we're going to talk about with terminology is actually the idea of the world. This is going to come up later, so I thought this would be kind of a fun one to throw in there. You might not actually even think about this one. It's kind of like space. You might not actually think about, well, what's the word for this kind of abstract concept? World is basically what everything in the drawing is. The world contains all of it for your drawing. So everything the light touches is basically world. And now for your first cat tax. This is Zuri. She's a very fluffy cat, actually quite a bit smaller. I actually saw another picture of Zuri where she had some of her fur had to be shaved off to get a shot, and she had like a little tiny chicken leg. So anyway, this is Zuri. She's 13. So Zuri the cat, everyone. Apologies. I messed up a slide, an animation in one of the slides, and now thanks to editing magic, I'm back. So let's talk about blocks now and the block snapper. The block snapper is a snapper that actually contains a space or seems to contain a space. So when you make a block, that thing you make is in fact a snapper. It has a space in it, which also has snappers inside of it. That should make you feel a little bit like this if you've been paying attention. It's pretty weird. It's pretty strange behavior. So it's a snapper and it contains a space. What does that mean? How does that work? So I'm going to break this down really slowly for you. Here's an example where I make a block, right? So I click a thing, choose select all, and then create a block for it. And I also inserted this chair. So put in the chair, select the thing, select all, which I fumble around with a little bit embarrassingly. And then I make a block. Anyway, I've now made a block, right? That thing I've just made becomes a block snapper. Block snappers have a space associated with them. This is called the block space. And to access the block space, you probably know this if you've ever used a block, but basically if you just double click on the block, you'll go inside into the block space. This is basically the space where you can manipulate these objects and do different things with them. We call this a block space. And while it feels like it's part of the block, it's actually not. It's referenced by it and it looks like it, but this is like kind of a bit of a deception that the developers are doing to you to make it make more sense, because the reality is actually quite strange. So this is the block space inside the block, but I'm going to actually say it's more of a reference to that thing. I'm also going to take a little bit of a side detour here and kind of break this whole thing down with an analogy. It's going to feel like you don't need it to start with, but I'm going to make a couple leaps towards the end that we're going to be glad it's here, I think. So imagine our snappers are actually some actors, and they come together and they make an episode of a television show. In this case, I'm going to call it Seinfeld. This episode of Seinfeld is now our block. Okay. And I'll say we copy a block. We actually just make another block snapper with a reference to the same space. It's not a copy of that space. It references the same one. So here I am just copying these guys, and you can see it looks identical because it's displaying to you the same idea of that referenced space. So now, when I change the fabric on one of these chairs, I change it for all the chairs. Why? Because there aren't actually multiple chairs here for inside these blocks. It is the same chair being displayed to you over and over again. So back to our little analogy. Now I'm a television station. I'm going to duplicate this episode by broadcasting it, which is essentially the same as the way the block space works. We're looking at the block space, and then I put, for all these copies, all these other televisions, I give them the same episode. So now all these viewers are actually watching the same episode of Seinfeld. Not too bad. Now, the reason for this analogy is actually to talk about interacting with blocks, because something that feels intuitive to somebody who feels like they understand a block is going to ask a question. Well, why can't my block just connect to something outside of it? So we're going to keep an analogy world here for a second, and I'm actually going to pick out this guy here with the headset. Let's say headset guy decides he wants to call into the show. So he does, and Jerry Seinfeld actually picks up live there on the television screen. It's not Jerry Seinfeld at home. It is literally in this episode of Seinfeld. He is now interacting with the character in the show. That probably feels super weird, right? Maybe you've seen that in a TV show or something at some point. What should happen now that he's actually able to make that connection? Should only his episode of Seinfeld change? Well, that feels kind of weird, right? Because wasn't the whole point that when something changes in one of these, it changes in all of them? That doesn't feel like quite the right solution. But if we have this thing, this interruption happen to everybody, well, that's going to be really weird for all those people. Because Jerry Seinfeld now talking to somebody. Who's he talking to? And what's that person on the other end of the phone saying? Does that even make sense? So these are the kinds of sort of questions that we ask when we start talking about interacting with something inside of a block and outside of a block. Easiest example is talking about snapping. There's two parts to snapping. One's actually the idea of the connection itself, and the other is the idea of the location for that connection. So here is a couple of tables. And I'm going to say the one on the left is a block, and the one on the right is just a regular, good old-fashioned table. We can't actually make this happen, because if we were to connect to the block snapper, that doesn't feel like that big of a deal for a one-to-one thing. One block, one table, easy. If we were to copy that block and have another table attached to that block in the same way, specifically the table inside the block in the same way. Now there's two tables on one end of that connection and one table on the other. So when you ask that table, are you connected to somebody? It'll say yes. And if you ask it where it's connected to somebody, it'll say in this exact same spot on two different people. That's super weird, especially because one of them is actually really far from the other. So the idea of connection grows complicated super fast. Connections between those objects require both objects to approve of the connection. And really that first object can't approve of the second because it believes its space is being taken up. Probably a little weird. Let's try something a little bit different. Location. That's another part of this, right? Not just the idea of the connection itself, but the idea of how far away it is, because we can't have a thing snap from one location to another. But in order to be able to do that, I need to have both objects tell me what they need. So let's say I was going to try to get this one chair connected to one of those blocks. So that one chair that I've had hanging out here, there he is. And I say, hey, chair, where are you? And chair says, I'm over here. Easy, straightforward. And then to make sure that I have enough space, I ask the second chair, where are you? And instead, I get 5 answers. Because remember, there's one chair, and he's got 5 locations. This concept's a little bit weird to wrap your head around because it doesn't feel normal. Because I think that we've done a good job at Configura of displaying this complex idea in super simple ways as an end user. And that's something that's actually kind of common in the programming world. Though, to be honest, in CET, a lot of stuff is actually fairly straightforward. This is one of the things that I had a hard time wrapping my head around back when I was programming for an extension, because this very question came up to me and I started investigating why it couldn't be done. And this is the conclusion I kind of came to. I don't know, should have hurt your brain a little bit. So here's some cat tags for you. This is Minu and Cora. I super appreciate Minu because I just really like this picture where she's so close to the camera. These are a couple of my coworkers' cats. They're great. Their pictures are great. I haven't actually met the cats. Next up, inheritance. This is a programming principle. And basically the idea of inheritance is to allow you to have traits that can be inherited and not rewritten. So let's talk about what that looks like and why I'm even talking about it eventually. So inheritance is best, I find, with an analogy about animal taxonomy. Hopefully you took biology in high school. If you didn't, this might feel a little weird, but I think you'll be able to stay with me here. I got an animal, and that animal moves on its own and consumes other life to survive. This is how I define animal. These are the traits that are necessary for a thing to be an animal. Here's actually one of my favorite animals. This guy here is the mantis shrimp. If you're not familiar, go look him up after this presentation's over. I promise it will be worth your time because they're super cool. Mantis shrimps are arthropods. So they have invertebrae, which means, sorry, they don't have invertebrae. They are an invertebrate, which means they don't have a spine. They also have sectioned legs, like a bug or a crab. They're a crustacean. They live under the water, and they have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And they're mantis shrimp. Mantis shrimp have two properties I'm going to call the properties that matter for a mantis shrimp, though I'm sure there's more. They have incredibly powerful limbs. They have these little like boxing glove looking hands. And when they go, they actually go so fast, they cause little water bubbles that can actually break glass. In fact, if you own a mantis shrimp, which is possible, you actually have to have a certain thickness of glass around your aquarium. Otherwise, the mantis shrimp will just punch right through it. So you got to be super careful there. They also have super complicated eyes, and what makes those so interesting is they can see X-rays just by looking, which I think is super cool. Now let's compare the mantis shrimp to the crab. Crab is an animal, right? It moves on its own. It consumes other life to survive. They're arthropods, just like I was talking about. They're invertebrates with sectioned legs, so that counts. They're a crustacean. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and they dwell in the water. But they're a crab, and this is the distinction that's important. The crab has 10 legs, and the crab has pincers and appendages. It's got like little weird mouth things. The crab's faces are hideous. But they also have these little pinchy, doodads. That's what they're really well known for, right? So when you compare the mantis shrimp and the crab, they're very similar creatures as far as these properties go. They have all this stuff in common. And when you look at the crab and the mantis shrimp, they only have these things that are different. So what would be the point of rewriting all that code as a programmer? That would kind of stink, right? And that's actually a big part of the way that CM is developed. So let's look at some, I'm going to come up with some abstract kind of products. I got a 120-degree work surface here, and I also have just a straight table. Both of these objects are going to be snappers because I want them to be representative with space. I want them to have the ability to connect to other things. Both of these objects are going to be Model 3D snappers. That means they can be tagged and they have specified graphics. They're also going to be based on something called an abstract work surface, or they're both going to be abstract work surfaces. They're going to have graphics and snapping based on their shape. So I'm going to draw a little outline that's going to make graphics for them. And there's also going to be implementations for cutouts. The table has these properties. It has some leg positions and some table leaps available to it. These are unique to the table. My 120 is going to have support positions and a left and right-sided integration. Is it left-sided? Is it right-sided? That whole thing. When it comes to programming an extension, some of this stuff is actually things that Configura provide to developers. So this code here is something that we call core. And I'm going to go ahead and call core the content that is typically used by everyone. And then I'm going to talk about abstract. Abstract being this idea of sort of a vague sort of idea of a thing. In this case, the abstract work surfaces is part of one of our abstracts. Our abstract packages typically either have something very related to industry content or serve some very specific purpose, like downloading data or using that data that is downloaded. And then this is typically where the project code starts. So as a developer, you can actually manipulate these things, and not just at the level that you write them at either. So you can manipulate this left and right-sided integration. So let's say for my project in particular, I've decided I actually need to get rid of the right-sided integration. So I'm going to remove that from the 120-degree work surface. And that's something that someone else wrote in my project for my manufacturer. I also don't want this thing to be able to be tagged, so I'm going to remove that too. There you go. I've just done it. Okay, now for time for some cat tags. So this is, this is Buddy, the cat. This is my mom's cat. Yes, he is that large. In fact, he's actually bigger now, I think, than when he was in this picture. He's a very fat cat. Big chunky boy, which is actually my favorite kind of cat. I don't know why I like fat cats so much, but I think they're very silly. Anyway, poor Buddy is actually so big I haven't seen him in a few years because he can't get up the stairs of my mom and stepdad's house because he's just that big of a cat. So yeah, he's gotten real chunky. Next up, let's talk about this. Your updates get stuck at 90% plus. You're in the middle of an update and it gets stuck. I guarantee this has happened to you. And here's this GIF that we're seeing here is actually a live cut that I made to be able to talk about why this happens. I actually sped the video up 64 times so you can see how long that 7 seconds that was remaining actually lasted. So why does this happen? We got to talk about two things. We got to talk about update bars in general, and we got to talk about updates themselves for CET. So let's start with update bars, or progress bars, excuse me. So let's talk about a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I'm going to make a progress bar for this peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I'm going to make it from scratch. So I have peanuts and my strawberries and bread and a knife. So we need to know ahead of time how long this is going to take and what progress needs to be made. And also what information is trying to be communicated here. So when I go make my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, what's the right way to describe how far along that process I am? Let's say that there's a developer and a baker that are working on this problem, and the developer needs to show to the baker what the actual progress of making this peanut butter and jelly sandwich is. I'm just going to cut it into 4 chunks. 25% of the time is spent making the peanut butter. 25% of the time is spent with the jelly, or making the jelly. 25% the bread. And 25% the knife. All this combined makes me my sweet, sweet peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That would feel disingenuous to the baker because this is how they see the problem. The peanut butter itself, I looked up recipes for all this stuff, takes 10 minutes. The jelly has to set. That takes 24 hours. The bread takes 3 hours because we're making some fancy Japanese milk bread. Very cool stuff. And for the knife, I decided we have to cut the bread into slices. We have to get the peanut butter into a jar or something. So I'm going to go ahead and say that takes another 10 minutes. Or more like 20 minutes or so. So yeah, to a developer who had no idea how long this process was going to take, 25% felt like a reasonable guess. But realistically, you could see that so much of this was actually just making the jelly. So much of the time actually spent. So that's part of the problem, is that developers are often guessing how long a thing is going to take you. Now let's talk about the update process and what's actually happening at that 90%. So here's you using CET, and actually we're really talking about your computer at this point. So we were going to check for an update. So we're going to reach out to my Configura, and we're going to check and see what sort of stuff is available on the server for you in particular. So the first thing my Configura needs to do is figure out who you are. So is this one you? No. Yes, but we'll get back to that. And no, it's this person here. So this is you. Awesome. What do you need to update? Well, in your case, you're going to need these 4 extensions. So I'm going to give you all this. I'm going to put it into a downloadable thing here. I'm going to hand that downloadable thing back to you. This is what you download when you download an update. So now you have this thing. When you're given this thing, where does it go? It goes into a special folder called the subfolder. I'll show you where that is in a second in case you're interested. But the subfolder is filled with these folders called BG install. 1, 2, 3, they're in order and they have that 000 prefix for each number. Each CET update that's been installed since the last time CET has been installed, like reinstalled, is actually in this folder here. And this is actually how rolling back updates works, but I guess I'll talk about that next time. Anyway, so yeah, that stuff gets downloaded to that BG004 folder. Here's the CET data folder. And then inside that, you can see I'm going to reach out and touch the sub folder here. This is my personal installation of CET. I actually reinstalled it for this presentation. Excuse me. And you can see that's BG's install 004. It's got one file called log because this actually failed to install, but this one succeeded and I have 2 log files. I'll show you what that actually means. So CET actually runs what's called a sanity check to make sure your next update is going to be good. So the sanity check is basically an idea of how to determine if something makes sense in the simplest way possible. So what we want to try to determine is CET going to start up again when you're good to go? So I guess I'll back this up. Well, why don't we run CET to find out? So first you're going to run it with the stuff you already have, just to make sure that nothing got messed with already. When that happens, we make one of those log files and we shove it into that folder. That log file tells us about the experience that was had by the background version of CET running the entire time. That checked out. We're going to do it again. We're going to make another one of those log files. It's going to go into that folder. That did not check out, let's say. So this is what will happen. You'll get that little red error bar saying that the background install failed. That happened to me the other day, though typically I'm in a weird state compared to an end user, so it's probably not that big of a deal for me. If it succeeds, you get this guy. Updates are ready. Go ahead and update in the next restart. Or however you want to do it. So basically, the biggest reason that you get stuck at that 90% is because this part of the process is always very close to the end. Somewhere between 86 and 96% is when this actually ends up happening. So because of that, basically what you're waiting on is CET to start up twice. If your CET takes a long time, that process could take 20 minutes by itself. And now for some cat tags. This is Loki and Inoki. And Loki is the one on the left there in my friend's lap. And then this is both of their cats, both friends, their cats in the window hanging out. Next, we're going to talk about a phenomenon that I think is a big one that I hear about from user support. And that's, why are you giving me this message when that manufacturer is not in my drawing? Have you ever had this one happen to you? Like you load up an empty drawing and boom, you get this big list of stuff that you need, but there's nothing in it. So how in the world could you care about those things? What gives? So you remember that world thing we talked about before? I'm going to go ahead and show you a little bit of what world looks like. But basically, kind of to just give you the idea here, there's more in the drawing than you actually notice. So this is actually the inspector window. This is a developer-only feature that allows us to kind of see some information about stuff. Really, as an end user, you're probably not interested in this stuff. It gets kind of overwhelming a lot of times when I show this off to like a dealership or something because I'm curious to show them something. Their eyes kind of glaze over instantly. What we're looking at right now is actually the world for my drawing. And the world contains a space, and that space contains a floor snapper. So basically the floor is also a snapper. Surprise. Anyway, the reason I'm actually showing you this is to show you this guy right here. This is called auxiliary data, although I think it's actually spelled wrong, if I recall correctly. Sorry, I'm not that good at spelling. But this thing actually gives an idea of what kind of stuff is in this drawing that doesn't relate to a snapper, but kind of does. The kind of information that we need in the background and not in the foreground. I'm going to give you some examples of what kind of data we actually have in there. Basically, all the information in aux data is just information that's not worth storing on the snappers themselves. A great example of this is actually panel type elevations. So you can see at the bottom here, I have a panel type elevation that I slapped together with some different kind of size panels. There's 3 in there. That panel in the middle there is a little bit shorter than the other 2. I know it's kind of hard to see, but I'm guessing as designers, you probably can pick that up right away. So yeah, I have these 3 panel types available in this panel type elevation. I get rid of one, and my panel type elevation also gets rid of that one. That's perfect. That makes exact sense for what we want. And it would be perfectly fine for that information to be stored on the snapper if that was the only case that we had. However, if I get rid of that snapper, I don't want my panel type elevation to change, right? Because if that happened to me, then I'd have, the wrong panel type elevation. So there has to be some system outside of every individual snapper that does that. If we were to allow that information to just exist on the snapper, we'd have to constantly recheck over and over and over again. If that panel had that sort of panel type elevation. And then they wouldn't even necessarily match. We'd have to hold on to all that data anyway and do all that calculation for everything and double check, and it would just be a mess. So the best way to do it, let's just store that information elsewhere. This isn't the only thing that gets stored in there either. So there's all kinds of stuff. Some examples of things that you're probably familiar with is COMs, customers' own materials. Key types for PEDs. If you have a key for a pedestal, maybe you want the key type to be involved there. There's also embedded schemes that are involved. These tend to be things like you have a scheme, you want to embed it to the file. It's got to go somewhere, so why not put it in the aux data? That's basically made to do this sort of thing. And then we don't have 2 files either. Back to this Bobco idea. Well, let's just say the aux data is empty, because that's also not the only place that you can have data stored other places. It's probably the most common, to be totally honest, but it's not the only one. So the next thing up is this. I'm actually going to tell you a story about a time that I found an unusual piece of data that I think is kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about something else for just a second here. This is collaboration. It's an extension that exists primarily for the material handling industry. I don't mean, when I say material handling, I'm not talking about like handling different textiles, different textures, different materials to be applied to snappers. I'm talking about the people whose job it is to make a conveyor, put a box on it, and ship some material from one part of the conveyor to the other. So I'm talking about that industry specifically. Basically, what collaboration does is it basically is used so that multiple users can work on one drawing. I can get into the details if anybody's interested when I have the time towards the end, but just to very basically kind of get the point home is that essentially you check out different parts of the file individually and work on those, and then check them back in so that your coworkers can see the changes that you've made. It makes an interesting view mode as well, because you want to be able to see what other people are touching, what you're touching, and that kind of thing. And that's actually going to be critical for what comes next here. Here's my detective story. So a power user gets a hold of me at Experience a couple years ago, and they say, hey, I have this missing extension pop up for collaboration every single time I use a drawing in the last 6 months. That's my face when the user tells me that. It's a lot. I mean, that gives it a little bit short, isn't it? And this actually does something to me that I call nerd sniping. This is where I get stuck and hyper-focused on a particular problem. So I put my little detective hat on and I get out my magnifying glass and I start trying to figure out what's going on here. This one actually took me about a week on and off to figure out. And I'm basically going to show you what the problem was. So in short, it was actually a view clip that was the problem. But if you're here for the short version of that story, you're probably still in the wrong talk, because we're never going to give you the short version, right? So as you're aware, view clips have a filtering mechanism that allows users to filter out options for the view clip, allows people to, see what kind of things they actually want in here. I'm sure this is actually super handy. But the $1 million question is, for the filtering option, what should you be able to filter? What makes sense to be available to filter? And that depends on the content in the context of the state of CET. For example, we wouldn't really want to bother to worry about filtering out DWGs if there are no DWGs in the drawing. And there are other things that can actually add to the filtering options as well. One of them is the collaboration extension itself. Remember those view modes I was telling you about, those view clips, so they have to be based on something. So maybe we'd add a filter to be able to filter off certain parts of the drawing so you can't even see what your coworkers are working on, or maybe you just don't want to see that right now. That sort of thing. So we're going to go ahead and add some of those options. And then this is actually, I actually went back and I looked at the email where I told the user what happened to them. And so I'm just going to read this verbatim because I think I'm hilarious and very modest. So now I can see that you're just dying to know, okay, Adam, but what is the mechanism by which we do that? I will not be able to sleep until I know. My entire life depends on this because, I'm going to tell you anyway, so it doesn't really matter if you want to hear it or not, right? But this mechanism by which we add those filterable options is actually shown right here. This is called a view content filter group. And it turns out that anybody can make them and anyone can add them when they would like. When we generated the collaboration extension, we actually made one of these things. I want to be clear here that I don't think there's anything wrong with the collaboration extension. I actually think the person that designed this view content filter group made a mistake. And the mistake they made is that when these things get added, now that view mode has a dependency back all the way to whatever extension added that view content filter group. This is a pretty devious one, and I don't even think a lot of developers actually know about this guy here. So just a little fun tidbit that data can come from all kinds of unexpected places to cause those pop-up messages to happen. I actually brought this one up because there weren't any snappers in this drawing. It was actually a view content filter. Or sorry, a view clip. That was actually the problem. It was part of a template, not even like part of an actual drawing. Sorry, my echo went off halfway through there and I got distracted. Anyway, some more cat tax, except this isn't actually cat tax. This is dog tax. So on the left here, you have Loki again, not the same Loki, obviously, because this Loki's a husky, but a very handsome dog. I actually got one of the goofiest pictures of this dog I think I've ever seen in my life. He sometimes comes up and stands behind his owner, and I just think that dog's cute. But you know who else is cute? The dog on the right, Luna. That dog needs pets. I don't know how that dog has gone 5 seconds for someone to take a picture of her without getting a pet, because that dog just needs pets. Very sweet looking dog. Okay, next up, we're going to do undo steps. And if you've made it this far, we're almost to the end, folks. You're going to make it, I promise. Undo steps are actually indicators of changes made in a CET drawing. If we do our job right, an undo step basically feels like a single action you take in the software. If I'm being honest, undo steps actually can be broken further down into undo ops. Undo ops are actually like the individual things that need to change for something to happen. Again, if as a developer I'm doing my job, you should never have to think about an undo op in your life. But basically, it's just a piece of what you were doing. If you changed a panel to be this length and you had to change all the electrical inside that panel, when you hit undo, do you want to go back through all the electrical elements, changing their size? Probably not. You just want to go back to changing the panel because that's the action you took as a user. Makes sense? So we're going to dive right into this. So here's me placing a panel. Very exciting. Whew, I know. Honestly, I should probably just leave the presentation at this point because it's that great. So this made an undo step, and this is going to be a snapper insert step. This is called panel 01. And I'm calling it panel 01 just because it's the first panel we have, and this is a snapper insert. That's the kind of undo step that it is. There's actually multiple kinds, and eventually I'll show you a different one. But for now, just keep in mind that this is the snapper insert for panel 1. Now I'm going to add 3 more panels. So there's panel 2, panel 3, and panel 4. This whole thing is called the undo chain. This entire order of operations, all of the steps that were taken, boom, 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 boom. To get you to the point that you're at right now, there are 4 steps that have been taken, and these steps are in a chain called the undo chain. The first step is here. This is the earliest thing that happened, and the last step is here, the most recent thing. As a user, you have a position in that chain. And as someone using the software right now, this is the position of the undo chain here. So I'll go ahead and undo something. And that's it. I just undo the last panel that was inserted here. That knocks my position up by 1. I'm going to go ahead and redo that panel. Very exciting, I know. That puts my position down here. I'm going to undo a couple more things this time. So I'm actually going to undo all of these guys, and then I'm going to redo them too. So when I undo, I go up for the first panel that I undid, up for the second panel, up for the third panel. Basically, back to where it was way back at the beginning, first step. Now I redo, and I go back down the chain. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, next I'm actually going to change the camera angle. Boom, rotated the camera. Moving my snapper, or my position in the undo chain, down here. Pretty straightforward again. This is just a different kind of undo step. This one's rotating the camera. It counts. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually say, let's think about the reverse case a little bit. What happens if I go all the way up here by undoing, and all the way back down here again by redoing? And then I'm going to undo a couple more times actually too. What's that look like? Looks like this. Undo, undo, undo. Redo, redo, redo. Redo. Undo, undo. Okay. Now I'm going to change the camera again that I'm in this position. This is one of the things I find kind of like not necessarily intuitive about the undo chain. I'm not exactly sure what should happen. I think that some programs decide to do undo different than others. But in CET's case, this is what happens now. All these things that were past the position are now going to be retired. And we're just going to go ahead and toss those steps out. So basically, these things are now non-recoverable. We'll never get back to the point where we had that 4th panel ever again. And now we rotated the camera. And our position changes to be there. And now if I undo, you'll see that I only ever have 3 panels. And if I redo, I only ever have 3 panels too. So that's the fun of undo steps. The undo chain takes up a bunch of data, which means that realistically it has to have some sort of limits. I shouldn't say a bunch of data. It takes up some data. Oops. If it doesn't have limits, you'll eventually run out of memory. Your computer will run out of resources. So by default, the chain is actually limited to 60 steps. So another thing you might have noticed when you're using CET is that maybe you're just a rock star and you didn't have to undo anything for 60 different changes in a row. You're making a bunch of blocks and you're changing a bunch of tables and inserting a bunch of stuff. You're just getting started, blah, 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 blah. When you hit that 60th step, it'll actually reduce the stack by 1/6 or 10 steps. So the first 10 steps will actually be retired and the entire chain will move up in its place. No cat tax this time. Just a quick ask me anything. If you do have any questions, well, I guess you weren't here. So, and then last but not least, please give me some feedback. I really want to know how this one turned out in particular. If you don't know, I actually did help put the sessions together this year a little bit. There were people who were on the ground to be able to better decide like what each of our personas attending the conference were responsible for. But I'm kind of curious to know if this is the sort of content users were looking for when they said they were looking for more advanced stuff, or if this is just too much. So please, seriously, I would love the feedback one way or the other. Check out Snap Into It, and well, hopefully you'll see you around. Take it easy.